I'm Jim Weiss, Chairman and founder of Real Chemistry, and this is the Get Real with the Chairman podcast. I'm delighted to have Dr. Alicia Zhou with us today. As the CEO of the Cancer Research Institute, she's a key player in cancer innovation. With her extensive background in academia, healthcare, and nonprofits, Alicia offers unique insights into the future of cancer research. We'll discuss the latest in immunotherapy and explore the potential of AI in early diagnosis and prevention. Alicia will also share how she's guiding CRI toward new horizons. This conversation was incredibly enlightening, and I believe you'll find it just as engaging. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Every interaction helps us as we reach a broader audience. Enjoy the episode from wherever you're tuning in. Thanks for coming on the podcast, because I think it's such an exciting new era after, 10 years of my own personal involvement in the Cancer Research Institute about where it's going, how it's going to go. You choosing to join and think about a renewed vision, obviously based on what we've accomplished, but where we're going to go is really important. So tell me, why'd you do this?
Yeah, totally. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on this show. I'm really excited to be chatting with you. This is such an important topic, and it's such an interesting time for immunotherapy and cancer research. So why did I do this? It's a really good question. It's one that I ask myself sometimes. But I would say fundamentally, my identity is that I'm a biology nerd at the heart of it. I think that I am fascinated by the world of biology, molecular biology, and then how do we apply that towards human health? And for me, I started out my training actually in academia, really thinking that that was the sort of career I wanted to pursue. And then I realized very quickly that I wanted to have more impact. And so I spent, several years at the bench, actually 10 plus years training at institutions like MIT, Harvard, the UCSF, working in molecular biology, studying oncogenes. And then the last 10 years I spent in a startup called Color that was really trying to change the way we could access germline testing for cancer predisposition. And so that was really about getting technology into the hands of patients, which I felt was a really important next chapter for me. And so in many ways, for me now, coming into the Cancer Research Institute as a nonprofit, I think I bring a really unique perspective. I've spent 10 plus years at the bench. I spent another 10 years being the chief science officer of a healthcare startup in industry. I've looked at this problem from the oncogene gain of function side. I spent the last 9 plus years looking at it from the loss of function germline side. And now at CRI, the real focus here is how do we bring that all together with the lens of a nonprofit and looking at tumor microenvironment and the role of the immune system and how we really battle and fight this disease. And so it's a really sort of full circle for me, sort of sampling from all of these different places to now be here at CRI.
So as a CEO, can you encapsulate the vision for people as to where we go from here? Obviously, I guess what's past is prologue.
I appreciate that. I think what's past is important. I think one of the things about CRI is it has this long-standing legacy of funding cancer immunotherapy research, really from its very roots. It started out 70 years ago at a time when no one really understood or believed that immunotherapy as a category could exist. So I think that's a big piece of it, the legacy of where we started. The thing about CRI is that we have had the opportunity to be at the front line of sort of breakthrough scientific discoveries in the field of immunotherapy. We were right there at the sidelines funding some of that important work from its very beginning. I think at our roots, we are a research bench-oriented organization. We really believe in the power of basic science. But I think what's also really important when I think about what the next step is for CRI is how do we now fully look at where our legacy has led us to. We now have today dozens of immunotherapies that are FDA approved and available for first-line treatment in patients. So as an organization, it's important for us to continue to keep on in that narrative. So there's a couple important things. Research programs are, of course, important, and they are the legacy of the work that we've done. But now we also have the opportunity to work in clinical programs. And here I'm talking about clinical trials and making sure that the right combinations of therapies are being tested and treated in patients, but also novel technologies are being brought to bear for patient treatments. I think also it's really important in this current field of life sciences, all of life sciences is now embracing the sort of data-driven discovery. And so for CRI, it's important for us also to recognize the importance of adopting data. And so for me, that means that we need to start a new pillar that's really embracing data programs. And then the fourth pillar that I think is incredibly important and for us not to forget is the patient side, to ensure that now that we've benefited from and had the opportunity to bring all of these life-changing immunotherapies to market, we now have the opportunity and the privilege to serve the patients who are now being treated by those same therapies. And so for me, it's really these four pillars: clinical, research, data, and patients. And that's really the full story of what CRI's impact can be.
And data, you mean the molecular data, right? You were talking about that's different than clinical or bench science, So is that bioinformatics? What is that?
That's a great question. So I think the thing for us to realize is that the data revolution, the AI revolution is here in every single sector. And obviously we've seen that take over in multiple different parts of our lives. As consumers, we see it every day. How has that affected life sciences? I think the best, most poignant way to think about it is this year's Nobel Prize in chemistry went to a combination of AI and molecular biology, right? So we saw for the first time a basic science Nobel Prize actually also was there to honor the impact of AI in helping to solve the protein folding problem. And that was the award that was given this year in chemistry, which was really that marriage of large language models and the ability to use generative AI to test any number of combinations added to the base of knowledge of biochemistry that we had about protein folding. And it was this combination that really solved that particular problem, which was pretty interesting to see, but also made us realize it is this intersection that's really going to be the next wave of discovery. So then the question is, for immunotherapy, what does that mean? We know that the data technologies are there. We know that LLMs exist. We know that there are neural networks and machine learning algorithms are being developed. But at the end of the day, in order to apply that to our field, we need to supply the clean data on which to train those algorithms. And so for me, then, I'm asking myself, what are the molecular data that are needed for the drug development pipeline from preclinical all the way through to clinical development that are necessary to be generated, sort of that data lake, that data pool that can be then used by these very advanced algorithms to find us new treatments. And so that's the place where I think we need to invest.
I'm glad to hear your view of focusing, right? Because focus always helps to get us to that next thing. When you think of immunotherapy today, is it everything we've traditionally thought about? I mean, help us understand what we mean by immunotherapy.
This is a really good question. So I think the way to think about this is there are today 4 categories of treatments that we can employ when it comes to treating cancer. Those 4 categories are surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, and the last category is immunotherapy. So the question is, what's the difference between immunotherapy and, say, traditional chemotherapy? The most simplest way to think about this is that chemotherapy is meant to treat the tumor. Immunotherapy is there to treat the immune system. And by doing this, we are activating the immune system to be able to attack the cancer. And so this is actually a really novel way of thinking about how we treat cancer. It's about activating an existing mechanism that we have in our bodies, our immune systems, and targeting it towards the disease that is cancer. And so it's really thinking about how do we activate, edit, and target this very effective sort of defense mechanism that we have in our bodies. How do we use that to go after cancer? And the answer is actually, it doesn't always work by itself, and it doesn't always work for all tumors. But in many cases, what we find is that immunotherapy in combination with chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery can be the right formula for treating cancer. I think the things to recognize and understand is that immunotherapy, just like chemotherapies, have to undergo the same rigorous clinical trial testing process as any other drug. So one of the first things that happens in a clinical trial is that your phase 1 clinical trial is you're testing dose and safety. So what you're doing is you're actually going to start and do an escalating dose of your therapy. You're not even looking for efficacy. You're not looking to see that it's actually making a difference in terms of treating the tumor, stopping the tumor, shrinking the tumor. what you're looking for is what's the tolerated dose within a patient, and then what are the side effects that are experienced. So it is definitely true that immunotherapy does have side effects. I also know that these drugs are thoroughly tested for these kinds of safety concerns. The other thing to know here is that often immunotherapy is given in combination with chemotherapy.
You rarely see them not put together. I know that in my own experience, but what role does CRI play in that, in exploring new combinations? It seems that we put Keytruda next to a lot of things. Not everything has happened, right?
Yes. So where I think the most important part of what CRI has done and what's quite unique about us as an organization is that from the very beginning, we've always wanted to fund scientists. And what I mean by that is that we really believe that the individual themselves is capable of making breakthroughs. And so we actually select our awards based off of the individual, the person, the scientist, and not necessarily based off of the projects. Now, obviously, the projects have a lot to do with the outcomes that can be achieved by those scientists, but I think it's actually kind of similar to that sort of VC funding model of funding founders, not companies. Similarly, CRI funds scientists, not projects. And I think that's what makes it very unique. And I think that's why we have such a high hit rate in terms of funding some of the best up and coming and brightest scientists. I think the other thing that's really important is the stage at which we fund. We fund postdoc fellows and we fund mid-career scientists in our STAR Award. These are two very important moments within an academic scientist's career where that extra bit of funding can make a huge difference in terms of the impact that person can have. It can mean the difference between buying that microscope that you need for your experiments versus not. It can be the difference between hiring that technician that you need versus not. And so I think it's very important that we continue that work. In terms of the areas that I want to change, I think it's more about thinking about the growth potential. So today, CRI is able to raise and gift about $30 million in funding a year, which I think is a significant impact and allows us to fund some of these research programs. If we are to really do the full spectrum diversified program funding that I like to do, which is clinical programs, research programs, data, and patient programs, that requires top line growth. And so for me, it's not necessarily about stopping things, but it's more about investing in and diversifying the set of programs that we work on. And that I think really can add up to much larger impact than just research funding alone. So I think it's about really how do you invest in that ecosystem. For example, building that data asset will accelerate the research program. There's obviously a synergy there. And so it's really about thinking about how we do that.
One of the things we do with the podcast is my audience, to whom we market to, are very much, maybe you could tell me, the audience, what are some of the ways you'd like to begin to partner with them going forward into the future?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. So I think there's a couple of different areas to think about. So ultimately, CRI is a philanthropically funded nonprofit organization. And so it's always important for us to be able to find the right donors who are mission oriented and want to donate their funding towards scientific impact. That's first and foremost. But I also think as a nonprofit organization in the cancer space, I think it is our unique spot in the cancer ecosystem to think about how we maximize our impact through partnership. Unlike in academia or in industry, we aren't incentivized to compete. Our goal here actually is to maximize the impact of donor dollars. And so my thought here is, where are the right contributions of know-how for convening thought leadership and also bringing together the right group of folks to be able to move the field forward? So, for example, there are areas of work where the right thing to do is not necessarily to put funding, but actually to put effort and some elbow grease. So let's talk about, for example, the way we think about the adoption of immunotherapy and technologies in the world. What we know today is that immunotherapies are mostly accessible for folks that can access an academic medical center and get treatment through one of these very well-renowned NCI cancer centers. But we also know that immunotherapy is very useful to all sorts of patients, regardless of where you're getting treated. If you're at a community clinic, that's also really important. There's currently a lack of adoption and education of community oncologists on how best to use immunotherapies. So, for example, typically in an academic medical center, you see a patient that's presenting with non-small cell lung cancer. One of the first things you would do is to run a biomarker test to determine whether this individual has PD-L1. And if they are PD-L1 high, you will put that person on an immunotherapy before you even start chemotherapy. In a community clinic, if you didn't know that, a lot of times what happens is the same patient might present and you don't get that PD-L1 biomarker test done. Instead, you put that patient directly onto chemotherapy, which actually means they're now excluded from being able to be treated by immunotherapy. So there's a real access and education barrier there. And so for those kinds of efforts, it's really important to bring together the right groups of people to talk about how we can break down the barriers of access, improve adoption and education within the healthcare provider community. And so there's all sorts of different partnerships that are possible there.
That leads me to another question. What's holding back even more progress in all of this? Is it funding, right? Are there diversity challenges?
Yeah.
It's the healthcare systems come under quite a bit of fire, political factors. I mean, what do you think are some of the things that are holding things up as much as we've made amazing progress?
I kind of have multiple answers to this question. So maybe we'll just start with, I'll give you two. One, on the innovation side, I do think that the next set of breakthroughs will come from an initial set of hypotheses that are tested in silico first. So I mean, using computational methods first. I just think that what we have seen is that being able to try and model out different combinations using computational models is a much faster way to test initially all of your hypotheses about drug combinations. Now, the only way for those models to be somewhat accurate, because of course all models are wrong, but some are useful, is if the data that they are trained on are innately accurate, clean, and harmonized. And so that's where I feel very strongly that we need to invest on the data generation side. And I think in order to do that, that does require shared collaboration and know-how amongst many different parties. So CRI, of course, is a player in this, but we need to be partnering with the data generation vendors. So we're talking about the Illuminas and 10Xs of the world. We need to be partnering with the data hosting folks. We're talking about the AWSs of the world. We need to be partnering with the analytics folks. We're talking about the OpenAIs and DeepMinds of the world. So that's a very different way of collaborating than how organizations like CRI has collaborated in the past, right? So mostly our ecosystem today is academic health centers, research hospitals, and clinicians and researchers. These are new categories of people for us to engage. That's on sort of the innovation side. On the other end of the spectrum is the equity and adoption side. So we know that for some of these biologics, like Keytruda, the patent cliff is coming in 2028. And when that happens, what we expect to happen as well is that there should be more biosimilars that will hit the market, which should decrease the price of immunotherapy and increase the access. But if we don't actually invest in the adoption, there's basic standards that your community oncologist needs to understand.
I guess there could be, and why patients need to go in eyes wide open to ask the right questions.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things. When a person is approaching this topic area, a patient should always recognize that they are an equal participant in that conversation. The oncologist in the room certainly has the knowledge and expertise, and they're going to make recommendations, but ultimately it's a patient's decision on what they do. So there are some very important questions to be asked here. One is, what are the side effects that you might expect to experience? Two, what are the lifestyle changes that you might need to make during the time that you're on treatment? Are there any existing drugs that you're taking today that you need to stop during the time that you're on immunotherapy? And then also, how is that immunotherapy getting combined with the other therapies that you're on, whether that's radiation or chemotherapy? And what's the combination of that going to look like in terms of side effects? And then, very importantly, what does treatment look like? How many times do you need to undergo treatment? Is it going to be an infusion? Is it given orally? Is it an injection? How much time are you going to be down after each treatment? How many times do you have to go to the clinic? These are super, super important questions to ask. And I think a lot of patients, when they come to speak to a provider, they kind of just do a lot of the nodding and the receiving of information. But it's really important to be a participant in that conversation as well. And these are the questions that you should be asking.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a team sport. I have found, because these things are so new, they're just coming online for, in many cases, the combinations in particular that a lot of these oncologists and surgeons, and they all work kind of in silos because everything's referred around.
Yep.
I wouldn't say that they just don't have all the answers and they don't know everything. And it's just unusual, right? For us, we always think the doctor knows best and knows everything.
Yep.
Not always the case.
Yeah, totally. And the things to be aware of, is often when you do experience side effects, the places where you want to be really careful is around kidney and liver health. These are the two places where often you can get overwhelmed if you're having a combination of therapies being given at the same time. So that's something to be asking about right away. Is this going to be something that's going to be really hard on my liver or kidneys, and how healthy are my liver and kidneys today, and how well will I tolerate this therapy?
So let's talk a little bit about early detection, diagnosis, and prevention, because obviously it's harder to treat the further this cancer, any cancer, is along in its journey.
Yes. So I think what's really important to recognize and understand is a lot of the advances that we've made in terms of cancer outcomes and survival over the last, I would say, 50 years, a lot of those improvements in outcomes actually are attributed more to better screening and prevention than necessarily to better drugs. What that means is that we know that cancer is a disease that the earlier stage we can catch it, the better we can treat it. There's sort of a very first order reason for this, which is that the earlier stage that you can catch it, if it's a solid tumor, the smaller the tumor is, the more well-defined it is, so it can be surgically removed. And then by definition, it has not yet spread to other parts of your body, so it hasn't metastasized. So what that means is that we can do a much more precise job of going after that cancer. Surgery becomes a huge part of that equation versus when we're looking at later stage. Now, surgery becomes not such a great option because we might be talking about metastases that have spread to other parts of the body. And at that point, surgical intervention is not going to help. And that's where you really do need these additional chemical agents like chemotherapy and immunotherapy to help you. So early detection is key. And I think what we know, for example, in breast cancer, if you can get a detection of a breast cancer at stage 1, you're looking at a 99% survival likelihood. And that's a great outcome. But if you let it progress to stage 4, you're talking about like a 50% survival rate. So there is a real difference. And I think that's where it's really important to understand that sometimes we feel like we're a passenger in our health, but we can be a driver. And this is an area where it's really important on the prevention side, because of course, in order for prevention to work, you need to catch things before you have any symptoms. And so you have to be really proactive. You're going to be feeling great. You have no reason to necessarily go in for a test or to go into the doctor, but you have to be proactive about that. And I think that's something that's really important.
Given my own personal experience with late diagnosis and denial, I feel like there's really almost no downside. That's my message to people whenever I'm asked. The real question is what can you do about it? Are we closer to achieving precision in cancer care than we think? Are we getting there? Or I think the ability to design a vaccine is here and now and probably only increasing. We saw headlines in the UK for what they're doing with vaccines out of the National Health Service, and Moderna and others retooling what they did for COVID for cancer. Do we need to change the name of vaccines for cancer? Because I don't know that they're really, truly, properly vaccines anyway, but I don't know.
Right. They're not actually. They're not vaccines in the way that we think about vaccines being sort of prevention. I think of them as sort of that they're immune system priming agents, but not vaccines in the way that we think about like the flu vaccine.
Right. I think that's important to point out. Is that a thing now that we're going to see in the next few years become mainstream?
I hope so. I think this is a very promising area of development. So this concept of the cancer vaccine is really interesting because the idea here is that if we can extract very unique markers from a patient's specific tumor, and then we can use those unique markers that don't exist in the normal cells and only exist in the cancer cell. If we can use those unique markers to activate your immune system to go after that specific signature, now you're cooking, right? Now you're saying, okay, I'm going to go and use the immune system to go after this specific target. So as a category, as a concept, it's very promising. And we have seen some great outcomes in some of the clinical trials. Ultimately, the larger the tumor burden, the more you're asking from the drug or the immune system system to go and clean up. That's a lot to ask. And the interesting thing about cancer drug development is that typically when we come up with a new biologic or a new category of therapies, the only way for us to test them at the beginning is to test them on stage 4 patients who have failed every other type of therapy. These patients usually have pretty progressed disease, a very large cancer burden. Now this is sort of a last ditch effort. It's not surprising to me that cancer vaccines have not been super successful in that stage of disease, because simply at that point, there's just too much to be done. And you're asking your immune system to go after all of that. I think it's very important that during COVID, we learned about the delivery mechanisms that are going to be quite effective. So these lipid nanoparticles, which we all used and received as part of our COVID vaccines, we know they work. And the FDA has approved them and said that they are safe. And they have done this thing, which is unprecedented, which is they've allowed for the boosters to also get approvals without having to go through the entire clinical trial again. So instead of treating the boosters for COVID as a new therapeutic, they've said it's the same drug as the original vaccine. And I think of it as same suitcase, different package inside. So because of the precedent the FDA has set around COVID initial vaccine and then subsequent boosters, there's a real pathway now for somebody like Moderna or BioNTech, Pfizer to take these cancer vaccines and get them through a different sort of more accelerated approval. So I think on the regulatory side, there's a real pathway there. Then on the development side, I do think we have to try it in earlier stage tumors.
True. Well, I think we'll probably see more and more in that as the individualized, much like we did in CAR T and cell therapy. I mean, I guess that'll follow a similar model. What are your last thoughts, and what do you want our listeners to consider about supporting Cancer Research Institute?
I think the goal for CRI is to maximize the impact of the dollars that we receive. And what that means to me is that we are going to be examining deeply what are the transformative challenges and bets that we need to make in order to help accelerate the field. And sometimes those are going to be things that we can do ourselves. And sometimes those are problems that we have to solve in partnership with others. But what I would say is, I think as a nonprofit, what's important is that we do the work that nobody else is incentivized to do, because we can afford to do that. And what that means is some of the work that we do is not necessarily going to be the most sexy, groundbreaking, drug development work. Some of the work that we're going to be doing is some of the in the trenches, getting all the infrastructure set together, building a data platform, writing a policy white paper about adoption of standards, convening together thought leadership in the world around how do we think about biomarker selection for patients. These are not the most headline-making initiatives, but they are the ones that are necessary to unlock the next sort of breakthroughs or the next adoption cliffs that are coming. And so that's the thing about CRI, is that the money that gets donated to us will be used to solve what I believe are the transformative step function problems to be solved, even if those actual problems are not the most sort of headline-making problems. And so that's how I want to focus us as an organization.
Well, didn't the research of the prior 70 years, didn't it lay the groundwork for what we have today?
100%. Yes. And as a result of the work that we funded over the last 70 years, we were responsible for that first FDA approval of immunotherapy. That was ipilimumab from BMS. That was the true translation from bench science through to the development of a drug, and CRI was there at every single milestone. One of the key things that we did during the development of IPI was to recognize and show that you had to change your clinical trial design and your endpoints. And so it's really interesting. There's actually this bake-off that happened. I think it was IPI with BMS. There was another immunotherapy, CTLA-4 inhibitor. I think it was GSK that was developing it, or some other drug maker. They had almost the same sort of biologic mechanism, but the difference was that BMS recognized and understood, because of work that CRI was involved in, that when you do immunotherapy, the curves actually stay the same for about 4 months before they start to deviate from each other. And I'm talking about survival curves. And so for 4 months, you're looking at the curves and you're seeing that patients in the trial arm versus the standard arm look exactly the same. If you are not patient enough or you didn't set your endpoints correctly, you would expect this means that you haven't gotten the outcome that you wanted. BMS, because of the help of CRI, knew that this was what they should expect from the preclinical data. So they set their endpoint differently. They said, I expect for the first 4 months, nothing's going to happen. I'm going to start reading out at the 4-month cliff and then reading out for the next 12 months after that. And that's how they proved the efficacy of their drug. GSK didn't do that. And so as a result, they actually canceled their trial at 4 months because they didn't see a difference. And so CRI has been there at the sideline of these very important moments throughout history. That's not a sexy thing to tell you that the curves don't separate until 4 months, but it was crucial for that particular approval.
Well, just the knowledge, you said it before, it grows before it shrinks. So this is the mechanism, right? Which is a little different than what we're used to. So many of the things we work with blow the thing up, but blow every other cell up too. So that's very different. So really cool way to put that. It's a very exciting time. We both know it. We're both dedicated and involved here. And I like to end a little bit on some nice personal stuff. So I like to ask questions of my guests. What's your guilty pleasure and what's your not so guilty pleasure?
Okay, so my guilty pleasure is I really enjoy getting on whatever Netflix trend there is in terms of TV shows and movies. Very topical, but I'm a huge musicals fan. So Wicked is like all in my head right now. So I'm listening to the musical soundtrack. I'm listening to the movie soundtrack. My not so guilty pleasure, what I'm really interested in doing right now and where I spend a lot of my free time is I'm playing a lot of tennis. And then my husband has decided that he's this distance runner. He just decided this. And so I, as his running partner, have also started running distance. And actually, I find it very therapeutic. I think a lot of these initiatives that we've talked about today, I came up with while trying to run, 5-6 miles. And so I actually think it's a productivity hack is going on long distance runs and having the opportunity to think.
Okay. Well, we hope you go on a lot more runs. Get to the next breakthrough, Alicia. So we're going to talk desert islands. If you're caught on a desert island, what's the album you bring?
I'm a huge Ed Sheeran fan. And of his albums, my favorite is Equals, which is his not last album, but second to last album.
Awesome. I don't think I've never heard anyone say that one. That's good and unique. Well, look, it's been a blast just talking to you a little bit less formally than we normally do.
Yeah.
In the way things are. You're doing a fantastic job. Thank you for joining CRI. We look forward to many, many years of innovation. And I know you said not so exciting, but I think it will be exciting research and development that will change the course of many people's lives, which is, I know, why you do it. So anyway, thank you for doing it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
I agree. I learned a lot, by the way. Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening in today. The Get Real with the Chairman podcast is a production of Real Chemistry. I want to thank my team, led by executive producer Kate Voss, audio engineer Nick Murphy, and composer Matt Lipkins, and special thanks to Danielle Clark-Brown and the amazing team at Real Chemistry. If you like what you heard, don't forget to review our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Also, please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. Again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the road.